This is True News. I'm Rick Wiles. Today is Monday, June 28, 2010. This will be one of the most important broadcasts in the 11-year history of True News. Please inform your friends and loved ones to listen. You have my permission to copy it, post it on other websites, or use any other method of distribution. Please get the message out. It is urgent. Mr. Matthew Simmons will join me in a few minutes to give us his expert analysis of the Gulf oil crisis. Mr. Simmons is one of the most respected figures in the oil industry. That's what makes his sober assessment so chilling. If this is your first time to hear True News, please visit our website, truenews.com, every weekday. True News, Trunews, truenews.com. Mr. Matthew Simmons is on the telephone to discuss the ongoing calamity in the Gulf of Mexico. Mr. Simmons is the founder and former chairman of Simmons and Company International. He is a member of the National Petroleum Council and the CFR, and he's one of the world's leading advocates of peak oil. He is the author of the best-selling book, Twilight in the Desert, the coming Saudi oil shock in the world economy. Mr. Simmons, it's an honor to have you today. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. I wish I had more pleasant news to share with you.
Well, let's get into this calamity. You've been a very outspoken person about the BP oil disaster, and I've been closely monitoring your comments since April 20. You were criticized by a lot of people in May and early June for your estimates about how much oil is pouring into the Gulf, but BP has revised their figures at least 4 times, so time has proven you correct. My question is, are BP and Washington telling the American people the truth about what's going on, or are they suppressing the facts?
Well, first of all, I think let me just back up and say that on the morning of April 21st, when we turned on the morning Today show, is here in Maine, and we got this glaring report that there was a rig fire, and I saw the visual pictures of the Gulf of Mexico on fire, and one of the greatest rigs that has ever been built starting to melt. I said to my wife in the first 10 seconds, I said, "This is not a rig fire. That rig has 700 gallons of diesel on board. This must be the biggest blowout we've ever had." Now, I'm kind of fortunate or unfortunate of starting my career accidentally in being an investment banker to the oil service industry 45 days after the Santa Barbara oil spill. So blowouts have been kind of a topic, I wouldn't say near and dear to my heart, but all of the watching the evolution of Cameron Iron Works and Vetco and Vetco Gray and Hydro is to try to build bigger and bigger blowout preventers so that we didn't ever have blowouts again. And then we stopped ever drilling deep wells for a long, long period of time because they were too expensive. And I thought to myself, this isn't a rig fire. Who is? And then I realized within about 20 minutes that BP had created the illusion that because they still control all the news, and they created the illusion this was a rig fire. Well, that was great for 2 days until the rig sank. But when the fire still went on, they then said, "Oh, we have a leak." And they blamed it on the riser. Now, I know a lot about drilling risers because, again, I help finance a lot of these companies that make drilling risers. Drilling risers are basically 22.5 inches in circumference, and 2/3 of it is a plastic elastomer so that the drill string doesn't crack and break in currents. I thought, what are these people talking about? Are they just idiots? And then within a day or so, I realized they're not idiots at all. They obviously cut. BP is infamous in the last 15 years, which used to be a really great company. But when John Brown came in and patted himself on the back of being the biggest cost cutter in the world, he created a culture of basically pride of yourself on how much cost you can cut. And here they made the most egregious mistakes ever. And this is a well that should never have been drilled, and halfway through they should have quit, but they were desperate to book proven reserves. And so they must have realized when the well blew out that some people were going to have to go to jail unless they actually created the illusion that it was just a little leak coming from this riser. And that illusion is still alive and well today. 10 miles away from the riser there are fumes coming out from the Gulf of Mexico from an open hole that most of the scientists now pretty well agree by the spread of the oil lake has to be at least 120,000 barrels a day. But what's amazing is BP still, to give them credit, and they still basically have dominated the news, and the government is just befuddled about what to do. I mean, I've never met Admiral Thad Allen, but I hear that he's one of the finest public servants ever, but he doesn't know anything about this. So everybody is relying on BP for their information, and BP's lying through their teeth.
You said that there's a second leak about 10 miles away?
It's not a second leak. It's the blowout.
That's the blowout?
Yeah.
Then what are they showing us?
They're showing us, you have to visually picture a 22.5-inch circumference piece of white pipe. And out of that is a little tiny crack. And out of that is some fumes that are going about 3 to 4 feet high. And they cleverly hired all the ROVs, which are the only things you can see in the Gulf of Mexico, to hang right around that thing. So it wasn't until finally these big, nasty globs of slimy oil started showing up on beaches that the government sprung into action and said something must be going on we don't know about. And so the National Oceanographic Atmospheric NOAA commissioned their bevy of research vessels to start going out and doing what BP should have done from day one. Say, what is going on? And they started seeing these oil plumes.
Okay,
the plumes were so extensive that they finally put the finest research vessel we've ever made in America, the Thomas Jefferson, to work. And the Thomas Jefferson basically had airship down in New Orleans to put on the vessel the finest recording instruments that Woods Hole has ever had. And the Thomas Jefferson has basically totally confirmed that the open hole has no casing left, and that it's basically now, by the extent of how wide the oil lake is, it's basically got to be about 120,000 barrels a day. And unfortunately, at about 4,500 feet water depth, which you get frigid water, we have about a 400 to 500 foot, lake of toxic oil, and the gases coming out of that are so lethal. It's methane and butane and it's worse than mustard gas.
What are we looking at with these live webcams?
What you're looking at is a little tiny leak in the riser. It's like a leak in your radiator car.
Mm-hmm. But by now, Washington certainly knows that this is not true.
Well, I think Washington is in the last 10, 15 days has started to grasp the magnitude of this whole thing, and unfortunately, they're having to tiptoe lightly through this because I'm a fourth generation Republican, but I can't tell you how annoyed I am about the Republican Party politicizing this and making Obama look like a communist because he actually is beating up on BP. BP ought to have been the senior executive of BP ought to be in jail right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are going to be manslaughter charges come out of this.
Are you saying that, in your opinion, you think that BP has succeeded in hoodwinking Obama and most of the federal government up until now?
Until about 2 weeks ago, I think they almost pulled off the biggest scam in the history of the world. Now, when the news finally started getting through to the White House, give Obama his due. I mean, he was the one that basically demanded that the chairman of BP and the CEO of BP come to Washington, D.C. and said, we want $20 billion of your cash.
But why did he wait so long to have a meeting with
because
them?
they trusted BP.
Well, they've allowed
in benefit of hindsight, you can say that was stupid.
Yeah.
Why would anyone trust BP? But one of the oddities, in my opinion, is why was I the only person that was willing to speak up? Because I took a lot of crap.
I know you did. Well, why has BP been allowed to run the show?
Well, because they created the illusion that they were the only company in the world that had the technology to know how to solve this. you got to realize that they've only been a handful of offshore wells that have been drilled to these water depths and then going down 3 miles beyond that. And so BP had it's a bad analogy because it pales in comparison, but it's a little bit like when the Challenger blew up.
Mm-hmm.
And now with benefit of hindsight, we go back and say, well, we got so lax and casual about how easy this was that we basically didn't realize that O-rings basically can freeze in cold weather and then they blow up. But literally, BP created the illusion that they were the only company in the world that had the technology to control this, and the government believed them.
Mm-hmm.
Now we should go back and say, well, how stupid! We should have elected a president of the United States who was an expert in blow-up prevention. But you know who we could have elected? John McCain, who said, "Drill, baby, drill."
Mm-hmm. Well, I have been dismayed over the way Washington has just stood back and allowed BP to run the show.
Well, you know, the problem is, and I've had a lot of conversations in the last 2 weeks with some senior people in our government. The problem is that they still basically can't believe that BP, BP's actually pulled off an amazing public relations job.
Yes.
I'm saying that without us, no one in Washington has any idea what this is all about.
And certainly nobody in the news media either, because you don't see anybody in the national news media asking them some serious questions.
Well, I'll tell you, I give a lot of credit to the media because, again, they've given me more airtime unfortunately, in the last 60 days than I've ever had in my lifetime to get this message out.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that, for instance, CNN sent the first crew out to be on the Thomas Jefferson. And then they sent a video team to the ROV Center in Houma, Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
So I get a call from the person directing all this saying our television crew is actually at the ROV Center, and BP is saying there is the blow-up preventer. So the idea that we don't know where the blow-up preventer is, you're looking at it. So she said, do you believe this? I said, would you ask your crew to ask BP, do they really believe that this little box on this 22.5-inch riser weighs 325 tons and is 5 stories high? They said, well, that's confidential information.
All right, so you're saying that where the main leak is at,
it's 10 miles away.
10 miles away, and there's no casing left. So basically, we just got an open hole in the seafloor.
Yep, and the only way that anyone has ever dealt with plugging an open hole of this magnitude was what the Russians did 5 times successfully in the early 70s. They created a small, low-grade nuclear device, and they inserted it right down the wellbore, and finally detonated it, and it fused the rock into glass and shut it in. And if we don't do that, we will never shut this in.
Do you think Obama is seriously considering that option?
I'm sure they must be.
All right, so if we have 100,000...
But 2 weeks ago, they still believe BP that was BP every day puts out a press release saying, we captured 22,000 barrels of oil. Well, most of that is actually water.
If we have 100,000 barrels a day...
120,000.
All right, so 120,000. So it's over 3 million barrels a month pouring out. And the estimates are, what, 1 billion barrels that are in it?
Well, they unfortunately, why BP was going for broke on this is that they believed it was a 25 billion barrel oil field.
25 billion.
If it were a billion barrel oil field, they've lost money on it. So if we don't shut it in, then basically we're going to create I think probably unfortunately that maybe half the Gulf of Mexico is now a Dead Sea. There's no oxygen left.
You have said that at least 40% of the Gulf is now covered by oil?
Yeah. But it's way down. It's 4,500 feet below the surface. So all we're seeing is about, maybe way less than 1% showing up so far. But the hurricane, we all should pray that the hurricane ends, but it's not going to.
Mm-hmm.
And the swath, basically, it was amazing. Yet last evening, the news reports were all saying, it's going to basically, hit close to, way down into Mexico, so we're spared. Well, Now they're saying there's a 50-50 chance that it could actually be in Corpus Christi or Brownsville or higher. Well, I know enough about hurricanes because they've been very instrumental on the impact of drilling activities in the Gulf of Mexico. We have no idea yet. I mean, this hurricane could basically hit New Orleans. We won't know that for a day or two.
That's right. That's right.
But what it's going to do, it's going to bring to shore the toxic oil that we've only seen 1% of. And what really worries me the most is that stuff is so poisonous that we should be passing out gas masks like crazy. I'm told that all the oceanographic people on these research vessels are now wearing gas masks.
We've heard reports of methane gas levels at 1 million times normal.
Yeah, I mean, more. I think the New York Times reported a few days ago that there's been more methane released from this than the history of the world. And that stuff in your lungs is worse than the mustard gas.
Oh,
so if you think Saddam Hussein, did a bunch of people, this is the Saddam Hussein, squared.
Well, is there a danger of a massive methane gas eruption?
Well, yeah. I mean, if the hurricane brings this stuff to shore, I mean, I keep saying that we really basically should be at least have in place an evacuation plan to evacuate all the citizens of the Gulf Coast.
So you're not even talking about the seafloor erupting with a methane gas.
Oh, no, I'm talking about the stuff that's already there.
The methane that's already released. You're saying that this is so deadly that if it's brought in by a hurricane,
if the 400 to 500 feet lake, gets tossed up to the surface, then it could be the greatest nightmare we've ever seen, worse than any war we've ever had.
What's the danger of a massive methane gas explosion from the seafloor?
I actually think the explosion would be good news. I think the problem is that it's people breathing it into their lungs and dying.
Mm-hmm. But being asphyxiated, the methane replacing the oxygen.
Yeah.
Which when I was doing some research and I came across the story out of Cameroon, Africa, 1986, the lake.
Yeah.
The methane gas bubble came up and killed 1,800 people instantly.
Yeah. And how big is Cameroon?
That's not that big.
Relative to the people that live, across the Gulf Coast.
Do you have any estimate? I mean, with hurricane winds, how much?
What we know about hurricanes is that is that they stir up. I mean, one of the things that's odd about the Gulf of Mexico is how little we really know about it, because in the shallow parts of the Gulf of Mexico, it's very warm water, but when you get about 20 miles offshore, it turns into being like the Caribbean, and when you get 200 or 300 feet down, it turns into cold water. When you're down at basically in the outer continental shelf down to 5,000 feet, which is where the wellbore begins, it's basically 37-degree water. So it's frigid water. So the reason we've never seen this oil lake is it's a bed of tar. But what the hurricanes do is they churn up the cold water, and that's what saved Houston's bacon when after Katrina, is that Rita basically stopped because it was when they got closer to shore there was all this cold water. Well, now we're not going to have cold water. We're going to have deadly gases, deadly oil.
And we know that hurricanes definitely stir the currents on the bottom of the sea, because
we've only got about a 100-year history of that.
Yeah, because they're scientists have been warning about the danger of hurricanes breaking the oil pipelines on the Gulf floor. So you're saying the real danger is stirring up this massive lake of oil
that we've
rising
only seen
to the
just
top.
A fraction of so far.
And so that oil rising to the top is going to release all these deadly chemicals, which are going to be blown into the Gulf. Yeah,
well, we're going to paint the Gulf. If a hurricane basically comes on shore and brings this stuff up, unless it doesn't exist. Now, if BP's right, it won't exist. But the odds of them being right today is zero.
Or at least telling the truth.
Well, what's the difference between being right and telling the truth?
That's right, especially if you're dead, you're dead. Have you talked to any experts about how far these gases could travel?
Well, one of the senior research people on board the Thomas Jefferson told me is that they think basically it's about 120 miles wide now, and it starts at about 4,500 feet under the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, and it goes about 400 feet deep.
Okay, but with the hurricane winds, do you have an estimation of how far inland these gases
I don't have any
can be
idea,
carried?
but again, I mean, assume it's just 10 miles, it's a disaster.
Yes.
But if it gets in, for instance, if it gets through the Bolivar Strait, which is the little tiny gap between Galveston Island and Bolivar Island, then we poison the ship channel, and we shut down, one of America's most important energy sources. If it gets into the intercoastal waterways of Louisiana, it shuts that down. So about a week ago, there was a little tiny news report that came across either Reuters or Bloomberg saying that there are 18 power plants along the Gulf Coast that have already done their emergency preparedness to shut down if this gooey stuff that's now showing up in the beaches of Louisiana and Florida get within a half mile, because if there's such water hogs, it would shut them down. We could have the biggest blackout in American history and also a fuel shortage at the same time.
And there's also a water desalinization plant in Tampa.
Yeah.
So
one of the interesting pieces of news that someone told me last week from Fort Lauderdale is that the fishermen on the east coast of Florida are seeing species of fish that they've never seen before. They've all fled the Gulf of Mexico.
There's also a massive fish kill at Jacksonville.
Huh.
In the St. John River. And
really? Why, I wonder?
I don't know, and because they said they've died of oxygen depletion, and the experts say it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I've never. The guy that told me this publishes a newsletter, and he said there's been the fishermen around Fort Lauderdale are seeing species of fish that have never been in the east coast of Florida before.
So
maybe it's the migration of these fish that have already been poisoned.
So have we lost the Gulf of Mexico? Is it over?
Well, I hope not, but I think the odds are pretty high we have.
That it becomes the Dead Sea.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that was a term that I used about 3 days into this and got so severely criticized for being a sort of a Stephen King.
Well, this thing continues on and on and on. What are we into now? What is this?
We got to basically shut the well in, and the only way we're going to do that, in my opinion, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but I've read a whole lot. It sounds like a Dr. Strangelove sort of scenario, but in fact, I grew up in Utah, and during for 20 years. We did underground hydrogen bomb testing a mile underground, and about 100 miles north of Las Vegas. It never even set off a tremor.
Mm-hmm.
This is 3 miles under the seabed.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just such a scary sound that I think I sympathize with the people in Washington right now, and I think it's so unfair that they're being criticized, saying that this is their fault.
Well, I don't think it's their fault. I'm just dismayed that they have been so willing to believe BP.
Well, again, there were only a handful. I'll tell you what would have been great is if 4 or 5 other senior people in the industry, like senior people, but why should the government say there's this retired investment banker that now lives in Maine that's talking about this, and he must be right, and the whole rest of the industry must be wrong?
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty far-fetched. Talk about somebody crying wolf about weapons of mass destruction. But had Rex Tillerson, for instance, and I'll single him out because he finally last week, got praise for being so bold. He was only bold because he got subpoenaed.
What about Goldman Sachs and Tony Hayward selling a lot of their stock a month before the explosion?
Again, BP has pulled off so many. If you go back and look at their 15-year history when John Brown took over, they turned the North Slope into a rust pit. Alaska Pipeline is basically a third now full of sludge because of BP. The loss of lives and people that didn't die will never work again on Texas City was just tragic, but it was never their fault. It was always someone else's fault. So they got consumed with the idea of cost cutting. They became addicted to it.
In the very first days, the BP said they talked about a methane gas bubble coming up that set off this explosion.
Yeah.
Was that correct?
Oh yeah, it was absolutely correct. What they didn't tell people is that basically it blew the block protector off. We still have no idea where the block protector, the BOP, even is, because they immediately corralled every ROV, which are these fabulous machines that Oceanarian own 8 and manage the other 4, and said stay right on this riser, so that it wouldn't actually be allowed to go anyplace else.
I assume you don't have much hope that the relief wells are going to work.
Well, with no casing in the hull, I think most experts, and we've had so few blowouts in the last 40 years that there are not a lot of people still alive that understand this stuff. But I don't think anyone that really understands this thinks there's a chance of actually having a slant relief well work if there's no casing.
But these relief wells are, what, 2 months away?
Well, at best.
At best. So 2 to 3 months.
But the odds of them happening are somewhere between 5% and 0.
All right, so, is Mr. Obama going to wait the 60 to 90 days and give BP? Is he going to give them the time to do this and then say, this didn't work either?
Well, my guess is that they must be, the experts in Washington are just doing overtime now to say, what is going on? Take politics out of this. Our government basically is not prepared to deal with a crisis. We just systematically don't elect a government to deal with crisis unless you're in the middle of a war.
Mm-hmm.
And a hydrocarbon crisis, we haven't had one since the 2 hydrocarbon crises we had were in 73 and 79, and they were basically caused by blockage in the Middle East. So they're not a wide body of people in Washington, D.C. that understand this stuff. There is a wide body of people in Washington, D.C. called the energy lobby that are basically creating the illusion this is a big green conspiracy and BP is still a great company. And you only have to look at people like Joe Barton, who was so critical of the government's wasting money investigating a great company.
If you lived along the Gulf, what would you be doing right now?
Either evacuating or getting a gas mask.
Wow, those are 2 wonderful options.
Yeah, very sad. I think this is probably the saddest story I've ever even read about. This could make the Civil War look like a trivial incident in U.S. history.
It's pretty dramatic, Mr. Simmons. It's really, I mean...
Well, you just have to add the facts up.
Mm-hmm.
And say, how many people actually live along the Gulf Coast within 20 miles? I don't even know what the number is, but is it 10 million or 20 million people? Because you're talking about Brownsville all the way down to the Florida Keys.
There's a lot of speculation about a methane gas bubble induced tsunami. Is that a concern? I
don't know. I think if it were, we'd already had one. I think the hurricane, and what's interesting is that about 8 weeks ago, the Colorado State University weather hurricane experts, said that because of the heat of the water of the Gulf of Mexico, we're probably going to have the highest hurricane season we've had in 20 or 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow or another, there's the illusion that Alex is the only hurricane we're going to have.
Joe Bastardi was here a few weeks ago. He says there's a possibility this may be the all-time record.
Yeah, and it's all because of the temperature of the Gulf of Mexico. And ironically, it was a year ago that the Colorado State experts said we're probably not going to have a hurricane this year because the Gulf of Mexico is cool. And they were right.
That's correct. This is amazing. I'm pondering all this. What this means for the people. We have a lot of listeners along the Gulf Coast, and I'm thinking about them right now.
I can't tell you how sympathetic I am to all of them, because these are the pioneers of offshore oil and gas,
mm-hmm.
and the pioneers of our fishing industry, and our some of the great patriots of the United States.
What about the dispersants?
Well, that's another ugly story.
Mm-hmm.
Is that BP's assumption, and again, I think this was actually a legitimate assumption, because they were hoping like crazy that this giant oil field would be Louisiana Light, because that's the primary crude grade in these deep water fields,
mm-hmm.
which is very high quality oil. What they actually unfortunately found was a really ugly form of crude laden with a bunch of, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but aspartines. It's what asphalt comes
mm-hmm.
from. And so if it had been Louisiana Light, it all would have come to the surface. So as a result of that, they said, as long as we get dispersants and spray them, we'll put the whole thing out. Well, what they found was we don't have a big warehouse full of dispersants other than Nalco, who's a first-rate specialty chemical company, had a best-selling dispersant for spills. And 5 years ago, the European Union banned it, sort of like DDT, saying it's too toxic. So what BP found was a whole warehouse full of this dispersant that they could buy cheap. And I guess they assumed that it wouldn't be toxic in the Gulf of Mexico, and it was just the European Union being too cautious. So what they sprayed along the surface didn't have anything to do with the poisonous crude on the bottom, but it just added. But it's like a sneeze compared to the flu. But it didn't do any good. It just added, harm.
Well, what are we going to have with the hurricanes picking up the dispersants in the sea mist and blowing it?
Don't worry about the dispersants. They're minor compared to the toxic crude.
And you're comparing it to mustard gas.
Yeah, well, again, I don't understand this stuff. I just have
mm-hmm.
a remarkable group of scientists that, since I've become sort of a magnet, I get a lot of information over the transom. Someone saying, Mr. Simmons, let me tell you one more piece of bad news.
Methane is highly combustible. Is there any possibility of lightning igniting the methane?
What's going on right now, according to the people on board the Thomas Jefferson, is that the cauldron about 10 miles away from the riser leak is basically is like is just a total furnace of fire coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. The Thomas Jefferson was finally allowed 2 days ago to get within 1 kilometer. And when they first went out with all this stuff, that NERDA, which is the National Disaster Recovery Administration, which I'd never heard of their name before, limited them to staying 10 miles away from the cauldron because of risk of loss of life. And finally, they negotiated to get 3 miles. And finally, last week, they got within 1 kilometer, so they can finally start to, try to figure out where exactly is the wellbore, because there's no metal left, so they really don't even know exactly where the wellbore is. They know within 1 kilometer.
Did you say that there's fire coming out of it?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Several years ago, and I remember reporting a story in the program that scientists had discovered asphalt volcanoes
mm-hmm.
in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility that BP drilled into a volcano?
They could have, actually. I mean, not drilled into a volcano, but they could have. I was speaking at a dinner in early December for one of the major tanker organizations, and they invited once a year. They invite all their best customers to come for an appreciation, and the head of the shipping department at Petrobras in Brazil was supposed to be there, but he got the flu. So one of their top senior executives in their exploration program just happened to be in Houston, so he came in his place. And I was sitting next to him at dinner. I said, "Tell me about the Santos Basin, the Tupi field." I mean, how? I mean, is that as big as people are all saying? He said, we don't have a clue yet. He said that is the riskiest project that's ever been done. He said, first of all, it's about 300 kilometers from the nearest shore base, so just delivering the daily materials is a chore. Then you get materials on the drill ship, and the drill bit goes down through 7,000 to 8,000 feet of water, and then it starts penetrating through the crust, and you basically go down through 20,000 feet of salt. And you get below the salt, and you're nearing the center of the earth. He said the first three test wells at Tupi had an average temperature of 900 degrees Fahrenheit. And what some of us are worried about is, could we actually be penetrating the crust? And if we do, we'll create the largest man-made island in the history of the world. So this could have actually been penetrating, close to penetrating the crust.
Okay, this is starting to turn into a sci-fi nightmare.
Excuse me?
I said this is starting to turn into a science fiction nightmare now.
Oh yeah, I mean I can't imagine, if someone had written this up as a book, it would have been so incredible that no one would have read it.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist, but throughout this entire ordeal, the thought of a volcano has been on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have asked numerous guests. I've had geologists and other scientists on the program. I've asked them the same question. No one has really said it's a serious possibility, but something inside of me says this is far worse than any of us realize right now.
The deepest well that's ever been drilled, at least in U.S. history, was basically back in 1972 or 73, and it was something like the Big Bertha or something like that. It was in the Anadarko area of Oklahoma. They went down to 33,000 feet vertical depth, and for about 3 days they got the highest quality condensate ever, and then all of a sudden molten sulfur started coming out. And several people on the crew said, God, this is the Earth burping.
What is the depth? I've heard different figures. What is the depth of this?
23,000 feet vertical.
23,000?
Yep. 5,000 feet of water and then 18,000 feet of below the seabed.
Okay, so the total is 23,000 feet.
But what's also interesting is that the crust is not uniform. The crust is sort of like an elongated eggshell.
Mm-hmm. But there is fire coming out of this hole.
Yeah.
I have mentioned this on the program several times. I mean, it's just my own hunch that there was fire coming out of this thing. Again, I'm going back to Washington. They have to know this.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think my guess is their learning curve has gone up 100-fold in the last 10 days. But again, give BP their due. For about 45 to 50 days, they were totally in control of the news. And one of the interesting commentaries I had with a good friend of mine here, a neighbor, Major General Doug Odell, retired from the Marines, who's a very close friend of Admiral Allen. And I said, Doug, someone in the government needs to kick BP out. He said, well, the problem is that no one in the government has any idea what this is all about. Without BP's technology, we don't know what to do. I said, BP has no technology. They're making it up. It's the service companies. He said, well, what they're telling the government is the service companies were responsible for the problem. I mean, go back to Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction. I mean, that was how much misinformation was coming? That was trivial compared to this.
Mm-hmm.
But this would be like the United Nations hydrocarbon experts saying, "Trust me, I have all the technology," and then the United States government saying, "Oh no, we don't believe you."
And BP has also been very effective in suppressing or restraining state and local officials from doing anything. I've seen numerous reports of officials.
I don't understand this, but yesterday's New York Times had an article, the fact that most of the boats they hired were pleasure boats versus fishing boats. I guess they got them cheaper.
So, as far as a lot of the cleanup operation, is it smoke and mirrors? Is it just?
Yeah, it's smoke and mirrors.
So, what is BP really doing? Are they trying to figure out what to do, or
no? I think they're trying to basically create the illusion. They still are trying to create the illusion that it's all coming from this riser.
Mm-hmm.
And they know that riser basically excuse me.
That's right.
It's a mile long, 7-inch annular that was jam packed with condensate, and it's only 3 or 4 feet high in the plume. But they've created the illusion that that's the spill. There's still a lot of people that believe that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I bet probably 99% of America believes that.
And last week when they said the robot had compromised the well,
it's all a bunch of baloney.
They're just making stuff up as they go.
What was also interesting is when NOAA finally saw all these ugly streaks of goo showing up on the shores. That's when they put the research vessels to work, and BP strenuously objected to that, saying there are no plumes. We investigated that. This is just a diversion. Well, that was a cover-up.
If Washington has been hoodwinked and they wake up and they realize what BP is doing, they're going to have to slap some handcuffs on some executives.
I would think so. I mean, I think you're looking at manslaughter charges, frankly. I mean, 11 people are dead, and maybe a lot more people are going to die. So I think if they don't basically charge some people with manslaughter, they're going to be highly remiss.
Mm-hmm. Also, I saw a report in the immediate aftermath of the explosion that the survivors were taken somewhere and kept there until they signed legal documents that they would not speak.
Yep. They also had all the service companies, including board members of the service companies, sign a confidentiality agreement that they couldn't seek. So they actually put it in place. I mean, if you think that Watergate was something.
So BP was moving quickly in the hours after.
Very swiftly.
Okay, but apparently they knew something in February, because the report that we've seen is that they notified the Minerals Management Service I think on February 13 that they had a problem.
Well, this is something I didn't know until about 2 weeks ago. I think I've been following this as intensely as anybody. They actually, had been drilling for 2 or 3 months, and they decided that they didn't have a robust enough piece of equipment. So then this is all speculation, but I think what happened is that Thunder Horse, which is an enormously large amount of BP's production, went into a steep decline, which they still haven't announced to their shareholders. And they then decided they had to go back on Maconda and prove up so they could actually not write off a bunch of proven reserves. So they went back to this troubled well, and it was a problem well from day one.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the mustard gas mixture and the hurricane season, do you think the federal government will respond before the worst case scenario, or are they going to wait until there's
the worst case scenario is going to be on Thursday?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's kind of too late.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're spared and the hurricane actually hits below Brownsville, what we need to do is say, well, we were given a miracle blessing, and let's now make sure we don't relax.
You know what's going to happen if the federal government tells everyone along the Gulf Coast, you got to get out of here?
Well, I know what happened when Mayor Bill White tried to evacuate Houston because of Big Rita. Within 3 or 4 hours, we ran out of gasoline.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Ike was coming, the city of the greater Harris County did a far more controlled evacuation plan and asked most people to stay there. So we should have been planning this, but we've never had this kind of emergency before. So we're really caught flat-footed.
Mm-hmm. Have any of the scientists told you how long-lasting are the effects of the gas if it comes inland? Are we talking hours, days? Is this?
Well, here's what I heard from one of the senior people on board the Thomas Jefferson. Is he said when they got restricted to stay on this 3-mile ring from the cauldron, they were very carefully measuring, putting these careful testing to measure what is this crude. They were in fine shape for 2/3 because they were downwind. When they finally got the last top, they got into upwind, and within 20 minutes they all got sick. So they spent several days at the Homa Medical Center.
Mm-hmm.
That's 20 minutes.
All I can say to the folks living along the Gulf, and if you have family or friends along the Gulf of Mexico, please take this program seriously. Take this warning
First
seriously.
First of all, I don't know how many gas masks we even have in the United States, but the cheapest insurance policy anyone could do is get gas masks.
Mm-hmm.
It's a legal requirement if you're on the rig floor of a drilling a well where there's the presence of a low level of hydrogen sulfide, you have to actually have a gas mask on your body because an alarm goes off and you have 20 seconds to put it on. So
and
we have a lot of scientific history of how lethal this stuff is.
Yes. And as we all know, there's not going to be any warning
No.
for the people.
That was the tragedy on the Transocean rig, is they had 1 second before it blew out. And I'll tell you what, the heroes on Transocean, I don't know if you've seen any of the videos of the widow of the guy that came home on shore leave and said there's something going so wrong on this. I'm not sure I'll come back alive. So he drew up a will and told his wife how to raise the kids. And he was the person that basically stayed on, ran the joystick and moved the rig 1,500 feet away from the cauldron so that 121 people could jump off. And then he burned to death.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when BP basically announced last week that told all their vendors that once this is over, they're going to all be sued for gross negligence. That one individual should get a Congressional Medal of Honor.
Yes. I did see the 60-minute interview with the man who jumped 90 feet into the oil.
But see, if the guy had not moved the rig, a third of a mile away, they would have burned to death.
We're on the east coast of Florida. Do the people living on the east coast of Florida have anything to fear about this?
I would think that the east coast of Florida is spared because, first of all, unfortunately, the loop currents loop in the Gulf of Mexico, and the idea that it's going to get in the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream basically goes from the surface of the Atlantic Ocean down about 1,000 feet, and then you get into placid water. So, in a funny sense, it would probably be a blessing in disguise if you could disperse this out of the Gulf of Mexico. But I think the east coast of Florida is going to be in fine shape.
All right. I wish we could continue, but we are out of time. My guest
I'm
today.
glad you're doing this story. This is truly a tragic, piece of American history.
It is, and it's going to change our country.
Yep, profoundly.
It's going to change our nation. My guest today, Mr. Matthew Simmons, the founder and chairman of Simmons & Company International. Mr. Simmons, thank you so much. Appreciate you coming on the program, and we'll be glad to have you back on.
I'd love to come on, sometime and say, boy, I was wrong.
Yes, sir. Me too. But right now, you've been right throughout this crisis.
Sadly.
Yes. So thank you for coming on the program, and please continue speaking out. A lot of people are counting on you to give us the facts.